Warning: the following video contains references to violence, character death, human trafficking, psychological neglect, genocide, imprisonment, alcohol abuse, fascism, and cringe. Viewer discretion is advised. Steven Universe was a popular show on Cartoon Network for much of the 2010s. It featured a primarily female cast of crystal space ladies fighting space fascism with the power of their space gems, their unique space abilities, but mostly through love and sometimes with half-baked redemption arcs in between. While the concept was interesting enough on its own, what really made it special was its LGBTQ representation. All across the show, queer-coded and fully out LGBT characters could be found, with the event leading up to the final conflict of the show being the first ever wedding of a lesbian couple in an animated show. It was inspiring to so many creators, including me, which is why we're here today. I'm V for Verbatim, and with Pride Month coming up, I'm starting my next major story revision with the spiritual predecessor of the Astral family story. Think of it as the openly gay cousin to the more subtle and closeted Astral story. Today we're only doing 3 characters, but I sincerely doubt that this video will be much shorter than the others, so sorry about that. Since, again, the story is pretty fruity, pronouns, sexualities, and anything in between will be important to the stories in some cases, and will be discussed if that is the case. And now, onto the lore. So, Chardonnay and Clova, or the Guardians of Norcasia, is a story I wrote like 2 pages for. 2 very informative pages, mind you. As per usual with my angsty preteen self, this story begins in a bar called the Dragon's Tongue, where a fish bartender talks to lesbian protagonist A, Chardonnay, about a friend set to be executed for helping her escape something. I really don't know where I was going with that. Clova shows up and somehow an adventure starts that I never wrote. I kind of forgot about that story for a while until I drew the characters again and decided to take the story in a different direction. It became a symbolic trek through the rings of hell, with each major threat to the trio of characters being a test for Chardonnay to fight her inner demons and become a better person, with the other 2 characters as her guardian angels, similar to how the story of Dante's Inferno works. However, I feel like that story requires a lot of the other characters to become, static, good or evil characters to work, so things have changed again, and I will explain the whole story in the final video, but here's the world-building fluff you need to be aware of for these 3 characters we're talking about today. As I've said before in a previous video, Pilagaran royals are the planets their ancestors live on. More on the Pilagarans to come, I promise you. But there are several notable illegitimate children of the Pilagaran royal line, created as a result of crossing species. They're what I call blood hybrids, which are different from an actual species called hybrids that are very similar. They typically take on Pilagaran forms until later in life when their bodies contort and become unnatural combinations of both species. It's usually painful, but psychological damage is the main thing for these guys. Being abandoned by their ancestors for something they can't control, like blood purity, has left some of them anguished, some of them desperate for affection, and some of them even bitter enough to conquer planets to prove their own legitimacy. I'm also going to briefly go over the Benegas again. I'll keep this brief since this is another thing from a previous video, but Benegas are skeletal aliens that were wiped out by the demon race. Abylos, the last of them, gave up his body and soul to bring a new Benega into existence to continue their species. Try to keep that shared soul thing in mind. And of course, we can't not talk about the Norcasian race since their name was in the original title and all. The Norcasians are crystalline creatures that are very much associated with the reflection of light. They are typically multicolored humanoids that were sort of representative of Americans. Sorry guys, I was kind of cynical about Americans as a kid, even though I am one. The Norcasians are run by a sort of monarchy, sort of democracy, because their queen acts as a president, but was mostly elected because of bloodline legitimacy. Norcasians were the founders of the Intergalactic Market, the center of trade for all species. It's located in the asteroids that surround the Norcasian solar system. Norcasians are wealthy because of their control over that galactic trade, and they tend to be less than morally sound when it comes to what's actually traded on the market. They've encouraged the sale and purchase of sentient aliens for servitude and other things. The Praetoxy race, space cats with horns and 6 tails that lay crystal eggs, were the most significantly impacted, and the majority of them were forced into servitude. Keep in mind, this is all information that our protagonists would learn throughout the story as they begin to question their devotion to their homeworld. And lastly, I promise you, LGBTQ rights in space. While things are less than great with demon-led genocides, greedy American aliens, and legalized human trafficking, there is one upside in space. Being gay is totally fine. Gender too is pretty loose, with many species, especially shapeshifters, not following traditional gender classifications. So gay, trans, ace, all totally cool and respected in space. This story is meant to showcase the LGBTQ community in a positive light, not bog them down with how homophobes and disrespectful people treat them. Making space an accepting place was part of that mission for this story. Space exposition finally done, let's get over to the first 3 characters we're going to talk about. Unnamed Space Elf, Unnamed Benega Dude, and Unnamed Blood Hybrid antagonist character. Space Elf was literally just a blind girl out to kill Chardonnay, but she becomes friends with the trio. Originally, she had swords instead of hands due to the events that took place outside of the story that were possibly Chardonnay's fault. Abelos' descendant was shy and originally not really part of the story, he was more like a cameo kind of thing. Oh, but I did have it so the kid was part of a space peace organization, but that's not really important to this story and made me discard it entirely. And Blood Hybrid character. They're not in any of my past drawings, they weren't in the story for a while, and they're not even a character anywhere else. But they're a royal/political leader of some kind, and that will be expanded upon in this redraw. Yeah, so this story isn't exactly well developed. In my defense, just making characters was my priority back then, not giving them proper TLC. Let's get to changing that, shall we? As a last note, I'll be giving each character a unique, useless skill that's helpful in the story, and each character of the main group will also have a D&D class that corresponds with their function in the story. I have a lot of characters that have the same function, so I want to vary things up a little bit more by giving myself that prompt. So now that we're all on the same page, let's begin. So this character was originally Abelos' child. I've always kind of drawn him as this really shy kid, sometimes with a scarf, and I don't really like either of those ideas anymore. I didn't actually think about how he would work in the story until this revision, so I'm actually gonna have to completely scrap his original idea here. Here's his new story. Abelos' kid was an entertainer who was cut off and set on his own by his grandfather to explore the world. He really preferred comfort, so instead of actually doing that, he followed his grandfather, Mr. Bones' footsteps in music. He would do ballad commissions for heroes. And by that I mean he charged a flat fee to adventurers, and he would write songs about people's exploits that they, and only they, could profit off of and market. He did this by giving heroes he wrote songs for a digital seal of some kind. It was very, very lucrative for him, and he never actually had to lift a finger out of a comfortable life to do it. If you couldn't tell, Abelos' kid is kind of in the NFT business in space. But because he's given a ton of heroes this digital seal thing, Chardonnay, Lynn, and Clova think that he assisted all of these people in their adventures, and they convince him to join them, only for him to just kind of write songs about their various failures along the way because he's annoyed at having been dragged into a political mess. He gets over a slump though when he falls for the person they're actually trying to find, and begins writing songs to help them overcome various obstacles. He even writes a song specifically for Cherry and Clova free of charge. And clearly that is the pinnacle of character growth right there. He's obviously a bard, and his instrument of choice is a stringed instrument similar to a datara, a Bengali instrument with 4 or 5 strings. His unconventional skill is his trend-following savviness. He's good at chasing what's popular because he's seen and heard stories from his grandpa Mr. Bones about the history of the entire universe, and can predict pretty accurately what people will respond to accordingly. Despite having the knowledge and musical talent from his omnipotent Grim Reaper grandparents, his soul is still Abelos. He gets flashes of a life he never lived and occasionally finds himself switching between his past and present selves. Sometimes he's good with children like Abelos, and he occasionally finds himself unable to write lyrics and forgetful about the fundamentals of his instrument. Though that's all stuff that would be played for comedic purpose, and not really dwelled on much. He shares some of Abelos' fundamental personality as well as Mr. Bones. While he's more of an apathetic and slightly self-aggrandizing person like Mr. Bones, he can be bitter about things for a long time, he has a built-in bias against demons, and he can be very loyal to those who tolerate him, like his father. Anyway, here I actually draw him out. Anatomically, he's a little different than Abelos. While he has horns, red markings above his eyes, even the crack on the side of his skull, his hands and legs are more akin to a human skeleton, which is partially because Mr. Bones used his own powers to create him, and he's more humanoid than Abelos. I also wanted to give him more of a hippie vibe than his father. Plus, I was kind of in a robe mood. I figured the layers of classy-looking robes would fit his personality and profession better. The Dotara is purple, a reflection of his childhood in the Death Realm's purple light. As I finished coloring this Skelly boy, I've got to mention that this character's importance to the romantic spiderweb of this story. He's pansexual, and as a word of warning for stories ahead, if the character's into music or plays an instrument of some kind, the likelihood that they're straight is like 1%. So since I mentioned that the literal embodiments of death, Mr. Bones, started a band, make of that what you will. But Mr. Bones is part of a complicated sort of romance, sort of friendship with Master Death. Back to this character though. He kind of falls for the antagonist of the first half of the story. He tends to lean towards showing his love for people through action. In this case, he writes a ton of songs subconsciously about him and the antagonist that are basically fanfiction, and he ends up being pretty useless in battle against the guy. It's important to the story though, because through their interactions, it becomes clear that the antagonist is not actually the antagonist of this story, and we're going to be getting to that right now. The Blood Hybrid is the child of one of the Piligaran royals, a young cousin that started a democratic branch of the regime. That's not to say that he was any kinder or more morally straight than his war-hardened family, however. He slept with an Norcasian queen and accidentally had a child with them, but refused to have anything to do with the infant. Thus, the Blood Hybrid grew up alone and with no guidance or dignity in the eyes of their kin, and as a result, they grew to become a figure with enough ambition and cruelty to make up for their soft-spokenness. In their isolated corner of the galaxy, they gathered an army of rebels, mercenaries, etc., all to compel their family to accept them and legitimize their position as royalty. They're royal on both sides, which is why they're a threat to Norcasia. They have more Norcasian royal blood than their current queen, a distant cousin of the old, heirless queen. Their plan was to take over the throne, but the underlying reason behind it is simply because they desire love and acceptance that they never received in childhood. Being of an isolated region of the universe, the Blood Hybrid doesn't know much about living with normal people. They know pain, both physical and mental, and assume that what they've been through can easily be taken away by gaining acceptance through conquest. That's why they believe they're in the right for doing what they're doing. It's through their meetings with Abelo's child that they begin to see other options and understand who they are cannot be so easily undone. The child taught him how to interpret music and written word in different ways, and he taught him how to dance while in the middle of combat. Abelo's kid is truly smooth. The two fell for each other over time and revealed their intentions to each other in secret. Here I made their drawing simple, and it wasn't as interesting as my skeleton child since they weren't much more than a concept. I gave them a very militaristic stance and look. They are a Piligaran royal, but they dress like any other soldier because they are a general to their army before they're a king. They're a humanoid creature that's a little bit fluffy. They do have a little brown fluff patch as a sort of beard, and that's where I kind of have to level with you guys. This character is very inspired by the Dreamer family in Undertale, so I'm sorry if that makes me an uncreative storyteller. I'm just trying to weave together like 700 character arcs here. It makes it kind of hard to, creative sometimes. So I hope you can forgive me. Anyway, their unconventional gift is expelling energy in non-lethal orbs of light. They use it to separate their body into fragments to avoid oncoming attacks. They also later use that skill to light the way for heroes once they are fully on their side. As a half Norcasian and half Piligaran, they are a being of light, and their skills reflect this. However, the fact that they use non-lethal abilities primarily is a signal that they aren't actually a bad person very early on. As for this character in Pride, obviously I keep calling them they, though they do consider themselves masculine and find male pronouns acceptable as well. They're not really into anything sexual in the story, though that's not to say that they're ace, and they pursue romantic relationships with men or others who identify as masculine, which obviously plays into the story quite a bit with him and Abelo's kid. He doesn't understand it as romance first though, so he comes across as very innocent in that regard. They're really a softie once they learn to put down their guard, and the first cracks in their mental armor being seen when he acts like a papa bear around the troops they command. Though they are neither a hero nor a villain at the beginning of the story, they eventually realize the error of their ways and join Chardonnay and Clova's party in the latter half of the story. The elf girl is closest to a rogue, but she does have access to a limited amount of magic, which ties into her unconventional skill, or lack thereof. She's a shapeshifter able to change her body exclusively into a rubbery substance like a squid or octopus, so she's learned that she can be slippery and flexible, She initially used her lackluster shape-shifting skills to steal things from the group without them noticing, hence her connection to the rogue class. She's connected to Chardonnay's journey through the sin of sloth, something we'll get to in a later video. But she and this elf girl do know each other. She was picking up supplies, booze, from the elf girl's planet while it was being attacked by invading colonizers. And instead of offering her ship to survivors hiding in the supplier's location, she left and stole their supplies. The elf girl's eyes were fatally damaged when she was captured, and she was locked in a high-security prison with other survivors. The place was abandoned years later, and all of the prisoners were still locked inside of it, slowly wasting away along with the ship itself. The elf girl's pretty loopy by the time she meets Chardonnay again, being under the weird delusion that she's actually a burglar in a nuclear fallout, but she's lucid enough to recognize the woman that ruined her life. She's really jumpy and definitely doesn't trust easily, with her first instinct around Clova, an admittedly more approachable figure than Sherry, being to bite and steal from her. She's more animal than human at first, but as time goes on and she realizes what happened to her, she unravels and becomes childlike in her naivety. She clings to Lynn most of the time, another character that we'll get to, because she thinks he's a shapeshifter like her, and wants to learn how to become as beautiful as him. This evolves into a romance that Lynn can bounce back on after his previous rejection. Again, another story for later. But Lynn realizes that doing so would be taking advantage of the elf, and he ultimately decides to take her in as a friend over anything else. The elf girl is a trans woman. It's not important to the story in any way, but the one thing that grounded her while she was in prison was her understanding that she did not identify with the gender she was assigned at birth. She was able to keep what little lucidity she had because she knew herself and she held on to that. She's only attracted to men, which of course ties into her love for Lynn. So yeah, her design isn't that flashy here. She's a little more angular than the fluff boy blood hybrid. She moves around a lot and doesn't forgive easily, much less approachable despite being on Clova and Cherry's side from the beginning. Even when they all team up, she still attempts to kill Cherry constantly to a comedic extent. She refuses to take off her bonds and prison wear for a long time, which is pictured here. I made her hair a little sharper to make her stand out a little bit more, and looked like she was really suffering in prison. And the purple skin is more in reference to the cliche octopus coloration, you know, like purple octopus character kind of thing. While she isn't the most skilled shapeshifter or thief, she's definitely the most flexible, seeing as she had to learn how to be stealthy despite her limitations, and she had to kind of learn to cope with the worlds that she was not used to for a very long time. So yeah, we have these first 3 characters done. I definitely like drawing out 3 characters instead of 8 to 10. It gives me a little bit more time to just chill, you know? I hope you guys are enjoying Pride Month so far. I've found the whole thing super helpful in terms of repetition and art practice. I've always really liked the super colorful pride flags, so working with them in drawings has been really fun for me. But that's going to do it for today. Feel free to check out some of my other videos, especially the Pride Month shorts, if you're really tasting the rainbow this month. I do kind of explain this lore-related stuff a little bit more clearly in some of my other redraw videos, so if you're into the story so far, maybe give a couple others a watch. Just messing with you, you don't have to. I'll explain it as we go. But I've got other stuff on my channel too, a couple of reviews, a few song parodies. But if you're just stopping by, thanks for watching. I've truly appreciated the love and interest I've seen so far, so thank you. And as always, this is V for Verbatim, signing off until the next video. Take care, and show your love for someone today. Bye.